The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai, hoki mai, kia The Fold, ko Duncan Grieve, tōku ingoa. My guests, plural, today are Jack Tame, host of Q&A, and Alex Braae, his executive producer. Long-time fans of the spin-off will know that Alex Braae worked here for some years and was a really beloved member of our whānau as the founding editor of The Bulletin, whose current editor I had on the podcast last week. So it's been a little run. But, as it always is when you have someone who you're close with leave, it's kind of a wrenching process. But we were also just, as a collective, just so proud of him and that he'd gone to that EP role at such a storied program as Q&A, and were very confident he'd make a big success of it. And so it's proved. So what we're talking about today with Jack and Alex is really the thinking that goes into a show of that nature. And I think there is a sense that it's a show that's had some really smart people thinking about what it is, how it should be made, and its function in terms of political journalism and society more broadly. And that's kind of largely what we discuss. I also think that Jack has developed into one of the very best of the interviews this country has to offer. And I talk with him about the preparation and the different kind of style he brings to bear there. And also about, fundamentally, it is a bit odd that our one of our best interviewers, on a reasonably well-funded show with a very important mission, languishes to a certain extent at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and about the sort of challenges that represents, and whether there is, post the TVNZ RNZ merger, any scope for that kind of work to return to 7 p.m. Because, as I noted recently in my Corngate piece, in 2005, you had 3 different shows fronted by Susan Wood, Paul Holmes, and John Campbell, all doing these big statement interviews in front of the biggest possible audience at 7 p.m. And right now, much as the likes of Seven Sharp, Shortland Street, and The Project have important sort of socio-cultural roles to play, there doesn't feel like there is any place where a politician will have to deal with the consequences of something that happened that day under those white-hot lights, and I miss it. And then also a little bit about the challenges of taking that to a new digital audience, because fundamentally 7 p.m. just isn't what it was in terms of that sort of younger half of the New Zealand population. It's a fun chat. I hope you enjoy it. This is Jack Tame and Alex Braae on The Fold. Morena korua, and welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora. Thank you.
I'm excited to have you both up here. Both just good to see you again, Alex, and you, Jack. I feel like the last time we interacted in any profound way was when you were telling your Newstalk ZB audience about me mistaking wasabi for avocado.
That was just one of the highlights of my broadcasting career. And seeing you desperately looking for a place to spit it out, and so some ornamental pot plant or something, right?
It was at a really flash TVNZ event, and one of the many sort of humiliations of my career as a journalist. I'm just glad that you were there to witness it and then bring it to the nation. But I want to talk about Q&A. No, it's not about me. It's about how I feel like there's this thing with really long-running shows that they can have periods where they sort of just drift along and other periods where they get in motion, and that feels like what Q&A is up. Q&A is up to something at the moment, and I think, for example, the most recent saw you on location at Papakura Marae, and that is just not how a typical kind of national show, a show about national politics, tends to open. What are you doing when you head out into the field like that, and what are you trying to do with Q&A more broadly?
Well, thank you. I think we try to hit a few different notes on Q&A. So for a story like that, we hold a curious place in the news cycle in that we are always trying to think of two things, like what are the ongoing issues that are going to play out over a kind of medium term in the political cycle. And for something like that, issues such as like co-governance, Three Waters, there are subjects that you are going to return to repeatedly over a year or two. But there are also the stories that are kind of defining the news week. And we're in this weird space where at the start of the week we have to go, what is going to be the kind of big story at the end of this week? And so we try and, I think, have a bit of a mix of the kind of medium-term stories that are always there just chipping away, and then the more newsy elements. And inevitably, there's crossover between those two things as well. So for something like last weekend, we were looking for a new-ish take on COVID and on the pressures that the health system's under. And of course, and I don't mean any disrespect to them, we knew that we could go to the likes of Michael Baker or Susie Wiles or epidemiologists, and we called around some of those epidemiologists to get their take on things. But we just wanted to do something that would be a little bit different, I suppose. And from my perspective, I just like getting out of the studio as often as possible. I think Alex likes things in the field as well.
Yeah. Well, I think the good thing about TV as a medium, and this is something that I'm discovering all the time, is that it's it sounds trite, but it's a real seeing is believing sort of medium. So to have someone come into the studio and talk, I'm sure there are lots of interesting things to say on most of those sorts of interviews, but to actually get out and show people stuff in that way, I think it makes it hit home in a way that is much more powerful.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because it felt that way, and that when you're then holding a politician to account, for example, the fact that you can both draw on that and your audience will theoretically have seen that, it means that the health system's doing fine hits different, right? But in doing that, you've made sort of structural changes too, in that the panel of pundits. The sort of shining light of
I should probably take this bullet, I think.
That's it.
I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So
what have you done with this one of the most important roles?
Yeah. There's a TVNZ basement, and all of the pundits are locked up in there. No, it's a decision I made kind of over the course of last year, where so when I started in the job. 2 days later, the Delta lockdown happened. And so there were a couple of factors that made doing panels really, not particularly useful in a way, because you'd have to do everything over Zoom, or maybe at a pinch send a camera out to someone. So that made it look
shabby.
Yeah, less good. And there was also the fundamental fact of, when you're in a sort of emergency situation like that, there's not necessarily an awful lot that a pundit or a panelist can offer that will be insightful or new or move stories forward. And then after a while of doing that, I kind of realized that, and I'm at odds with some of our audience who send this feedback in, but I kind of realized that I didn't actually necessarily miss having those panelists, because if you want the views of pundits and analysts, and there's a lot of value in that, but you can kind of go a lot of places to get it. And we were in this position with Q&A where we are publicly funded to make journalism, so we should be doing primary source journalism, in my view. And pundits are very useful, but they are a secondary source of information, as it were. So we felt that because of that, we should be going directly to people who can have an impact on the news firsthand.
You haven't killed it forever necessarily.
No,
though, right?
no,
like if
absolutely
there's an
not.
appropriate moment or an appropriate subject, and maybe in an election year it will be slightly different. It'll be kind of like the woolly mammoth in the ice, and the tundra, where we pull out a couple of hairs and try and rekindle it. But I think it was a really good call.
Well, I think as well we would still do a panel at times when the panel is the best way of telling that particular story. So we had a panel around the start of this year with Emmeline Pickering-Martin and Fran O'Sullivan to give a couple of different perspectives on what was at that stage the very new cost of living crisis. We had Bernard Hickey and Rebecca Stevenson on to talk about different angles on the crash in Bitcoin and the crash in stock markets. So, I mean, sometimes it is actually the case that getting journalists or analysts or pundits or something on a panel is a good way of telling the story. But by and large, I feel that if you're funded to make journalism, then you should be going out and doing that primary source stuff.
It's maybe a future solution is, with Love Island, you have the show and then you have After Sun.
Yes.
And potentially like some kind of Q&A.
Q&A after dark, maybe.
Yeah. It's just a suggestion. I'm not trying to step on your toes. Actually, on that front, like you're now basically a year into having left your beloved bulletin.
Still read it.
I should hope so. Taking this bold and brave step. How are you handling it, Alex?
You could still fill a book with all of the things I don't know about making TV. It's a really big learning curve going to a different medium like that. It's not there are some things which transfer over, like understanding the news cycle, editorial judgment. Having that from one job means that going to another job is possible. But in terms of a medium, there's still heaps and heaps that I'm coming to learn about it all the time. And I'm quite lucky, I think, in that in the team that we've got, we have a lot of people who really understand TV as a medium and have those skills, which I really don't. So when it comes to the TV side of it, I'm still relying incredibly heavily on everyone else in the team, basically. But yeah, I mean, overall.
Do you even have a TV?
Yeah, I do. I do now. I do now. I didn't when I started, but I thought,
that's what you want.
Yeah.
That's what you want to producer.
Yeah. Throw away the remote. It's just one channel.
Yeah.
So Jack, obviously, recruiting is something that TVNZ is famously good at, especially in the news division lately. What made you think that Alex could just come out of this real specific job of the Bulletin and jump into, and I must say, I do think, much to my chagrin, he has absolutely crushed it for in terms of the sense of what an EP's influence is. But why did you sort of think this dude?
I think, well, first of all, it wasn't solely my decision.
I heard that it was all conducted over squash.
Well, there was a little bit of were some squash politics that were at play. No, I think we played squash a few months earlier, and we kind of hit it off then.
We actually haven't played squash since
who won?
I've started doing this job. I think it was pretty even.
Yeah, was it?
Yeah, pretty even.
It's pretty even.
I think. We spoke on the phone once for maybe 90 minutes after you'd applied for the job, and we kind of, I think we clicked over the things that we found interesting, in that they were the sorts of things that most people were completely bored by, but we actually thought, maybe we can, there's something, we're kind of on the same frequency here. I remember Alex was like, and this was 18 months ago. He's like, the thing that's just fascinating me at the moment, supply chains. And I was like, yeah, man. And he's like, if you look at like global shipping costs, and I was like, you got to see the latest numbers out of Rotterdam. They're really bad. We were like,
that's big Braae energy right there.
And I was like, there probably aren't that many people who are interested in these kinds of issues, but are interested in finding ways to explore these issues. In a format where we're not driven by kind of commercial imperatives in the same way that other shows were. So we spoke on the phone a bit, and we definitely hit it off. And I think we were attracted to exploring the same kinds of subjects, but also when it comes to interviews and things, we have a similar approach. And we also, for all the things we have in common, we have things that differ that really benefit each other. So, for example, Alex is 100% right. He knows nothing about television. And I know plenty about television because I've basically grown up with it. And I don't mean that to be critical, but it was wonderful because he could come in with a completely fresh perspective and go, well, hang on, why do you do that but standing up? And then I go, oh, shit, actually, good question. I don't know why we do it. We've just always done it like that. We don't need to do it like that. Let's change things. And I remember that, Alex is just fascinated by local body politics, and I'm really interested in foreign affairs. And so there are kind of some nice little, subjects where we offset each other, where his interests and my interests kind of meet in the middle, and we can combine our strengths. And I'm just so glad he came on. It's so good, and we're able to kind of sit in our corner of the newsroom, and I think we disagree fairly regularly.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think sometimes
we don't argue necessarily, but we disagree in a healthy way. Well, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I've worked with Alex. I know that disagreement is part of the role, and it's a fantastic.
It's the privilege of the role.
Yeah, and it's really important in terms of teasing out how you get to a better news product, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I mean, I think sometimes as well we argue or disagree in order to just test ideas, as it were. And I think that's it is something that is in modern media, the opportunity to sit around disagreeing with each other in order to come to the best conclusion is kind of an unimaginable luxury. But we have time to do that, and then once we have done that, we then have the resources to do something about it.
So, I mean, one of the things that comes across, I think, is that Jack feels like a very well prepped interviewer. Like you've sort of ascended to that sort of quite terrifying tier of the like Moana Maniapoto or Mihina Rangi Forbes or Kim Hill, where you can just imagine that if you're a politician, you're trudging in rather than going in with a spring in your step. What is the process how do the pair of you go into those big kind of statement interviews and not have them feel like they're just sort of the interview of the week or them doing the rounds, and have them feel like they've got that sort of freshness and they're going to be probed and different angles explored?
I don't think Jack is going to take credit here, so I'll say this one in that he does a lot of his prep himself, like a lot, in a way that is actually really unusual for broadcasters. And I think that comes from the sense of ultimately when the interview is happening, he has to be in the moment and have everything at his fingertips. I mean, like me and Siobhan Wilson, who is one of our producer, or sort of our main senior producer. What's the title? Yeah,
I don't know. Anyway, you're the boss, man.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. Anyway, she's brilliant. She does a lot to give the basis for what the interview should be about, but then Jack takes that and makes it completely his own and puts it in his own words, puts it in his own way of thinking, and is really genuinely across the issues that we're interviewing on.
That is very generous of you. I think it's probably, not to want to throw it all on Alex either. I think we do have a collaborative approach, but Alex and Siobhan will put in all of their kind of ideas and the subject matter that they think we should be digesting. But it's true that for a strong interview, the person who's in the chair needs to be over the information. And if you look at the very best interviewing, it is, I think, when you're not relying on notes, you're not relying on anything else, but you're so comfortable with the subject matter that you can focus 100% on what the interviewee is saying. And it sounds like a really kind of basic skill. But the thing about live interviewing, and particularly live television interviewing, is there's this massive kind of sense of pressure that comes with the moment. And even for the most practiced politician, there is this kind of sense of gravity, and you can feel like you're on the precipice of disaster really easily because you know that you're just one stuff up away from a YouTube clip or from stuff going viral on Twitter or whatever. And so I think with that kind of dynamic, it can be hard for some interviewers to actually focus on what the interviewee is saying. And at the times when I have felt like my interviewing is at its strongest, it's when I kind of subconsciously am in a zone where I'm 100% focused on what the person is saying. So I'm not worried about the ad breaks. I'm not worried about where the cameras are going. I'm not worried about the director giving me times in my ear. I'm not worried about notes, nothing else. I'm just 100% focused on what they say. And I guess I have this kind of lofty ethos when it comes to interviewing politicians in particular, in that I think our job is, and our responsibility is more than just to ask questions. It is to seek answers. And so, especially for elected officials, I like to be in a space where I can listen to exactly what they're saying, work out if they're actually answering something, and get in there pretty quickly if they're not, to try and cut the spin and get through to, to whatever the purpose of the interview is.
Well, yeah, not to go too lofty with it, but when it comes to those interviews, we actually have a role within the democratic system to anyone who is seeking or wielding power. We have a role to demand answers from them on behalf of the public, and I think that is something that we take pretty seriously.
Yeah, and one last point is it is kind of a luxury to be making one show a week compared to lots of other. Well, if you think about all the other live interviewing, right? So whether it's a morning news show or an evening news show, most of them are daily. Most of them have 3 minutes with a politician. To have 15 or 20 and an opportunity to actually read the report rather than just the executive summary is a massive luxury in news. And so I think we really benefit from that.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
There seems, I've been listening to Q&A rather than watching it over the past week, because you've got a podcast feed, which people should check out if 9 a.m. on a Sunday doesn't suit them, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But there seems to be there are some interviews that are kind of notably pointed. Like I'm thinking about the Chris Luxon interview when you were doing some quite intense live maths on him. And Kamal Sepuloni, around the sort of progress or lack thereof of disabled peoples under the Labour government, and then others which had a much more sort of reflective quality. I'm thinking about the second Andrew Costa interview or Louisa Wall's kind of exit interview. Do you know going in which path one is going to take, or is that sort of a function of the responses you get?
I think I know to a certain extent, in that I think different subjects and different interviewees require a different approach at different times. So I think like the Christopher Luxon interview, for example, I think we've interviewed him twice as leader. And the first interview we did was not nearly as pointed and I wasn't interrupting him at all really. And I was basically just It was shortly after he'd taken over, and so I was asking him questions about his kind of relationship with the treaty and his values as opposed to...
We really did want to get a sense of his values because at the time I think Chris Luxon was still quite an unknown quantity to most voters.
Yeah.
You know, so that was very much about, you know, I think still taking that ethos of challenge because he was seeking power or is seeking power, but also giving him an opportunity to explain his values in that sort of setting.
Yeah, and I suppose we ask ourselves what approach is going to get the most for the audience. And, you know, if you just went in and softballed a leader of the opposition or the Prime Minister or whoever, or, you know, a senior cabinet minister halfway through a term when they have lots of policy to talk to, just knowing how well practiced and how slick most of our senior politicians are at avoiding saying anything, I don't think you get anything for the audience. So for those kinds of interviews, I mean, for the Christopher Luxon interview, I think maybe some people... Yeah, people always view things through a really tribal lens, and maybe we can talk about that in a bit.
Well, people who think in those terms do.
They do.
I think a lot of our audience is not really tribal.
Yeah.
They're not really tribal political people in that sense, and they, you know, you could even say that a lot of them are probably the archetypical swing voter.
Right. But I mean, you know, but people who want an interview to be a kind of gladiatorial contest only want it to be a gladiatorial contest when their team is winning. And and you know, I think for like the Luxon interview, that previous one, I just know that he had been kind of pushing these lines and that the whole party had been pushing these lines, and there hadn't been a format until that point where someone actually had 15 or 20 minutes to go, hang on, let's actually examine all of these lines. And so we did, and I suppose it's different to like a Costa interview or something like that. But at the end of the day, it is what is the best approach for getting the most useful information for our audience.
So one thing, like we were talking off air about Corngate, which I recently wrote about, and there were a number of things which sort of seemed really interesting to me. One of the things that struck me was the extent to which a young John Campbell resembled you, both physically and in some respects, in this sort of kind of bizarre way.
Tame, a young John Campbell. How about that?
But
the office is going to be unbearable when that gets out. Eh?
But more to the point, in terms of that combination of, you know, he was highly prepped for that interview, and I think that went on to be he was for a period of time the sort of the emblematic interviewer of a particular era. And you've been around, you know, filled in for, you know, you were in a seat that was once occupied by Paul Holmes, you filled in for Mike Hosking, that you've been sort of there or thereabouts with a lot of the sort of titans of broadcasting. What were the sort of interviewers or broadcasters that really impacted you kind of growing up and even lately, and you know, here all from overseas that have really sort of, you've thought that's the way?
Well, I still listen to Hard Talk every week. Don't miss it. Love it. So Stephen Sackur, I'm not afraid to fanboy a little bit over Stephen Sackur. Growing up, I did watch Holmes and Campbell a lot, and you know, and really admired them and admired that slot, admired the 7 o'clock. You come down, you sit down, you come in, you sit down, you be interviewed. I have become quite good friends with Guy on Espiner, and I'm not just saying this because he is my friend, but I think he has kind of informed my approach to interviewing in that he can see that there's a continuum of approaches. Like you can go in really aggressively and pointedly and, you know, really seek information, but sometimes it's more effective to go in with a gentler touch. And I think that he really informs that. He's also someone who 100% believes when it comes to politicians in seeking answers rather than just asking questions. And I think that is something that sticks with me. When it comes to radio, which is a slightly different medium when it comes to interviewing because it doesn't have quite that same dynamic tension that television does, I honestly think Mike Hosking is an incredible interviewer and doesn't get the credit that he deserves. And I know there'll be people going, oh my God, that's disgusting. But I think Hosking's in a strata of broadcasting that very few New Zealanders have ever reached, and that right now he's absolutely popping. And he just has a way to cut to the to the core of it of a dispute or a subject or a policy that that few people have. And of course, I like hearing Kim Hill toy with someone along with the best of them. Yeah.
So that thing that you mentioned before, we've touched on a couple of times about 7 p.m. And there was a brief moment in 2005 when a politician could plausibly be interviewed on 3 different channels by 3 exceptional interviewers in the primest of prime time during an era of huge TV audiences. When you first got into Q&A, it had a little dalliance was it 9 p.m. on a Monday? And yet...
I think later. I think 9...
Yeah, was it that
maybe
early?
9:30?
It was 9:35, and then it was 9:45, and then it was 10:15.
10:15?
Well, because,
on a Monday?
Yeah, I know. Because depending on whether or not they had a BBC drama, if they had a BBC drama playing earlier in the night...
Stretch the ad breaks.
Exactly. They have to... Well, no, they had an hour long because the BBC didn't have ads. And so then everything behind it had to shift down. So we never had a regular time slot there.
I mean, which brings us back to, you've got this program which I think is humming. It's in this kind of commercial-free, it's right next to all the Christian programming. It rates pretty well. Like it's pretty regularly in the top 10 most viewed shows for New Zealand On Air funded programming, and yet it still feels like, in terms of the gap between the quality of the interviews and how important the subject matter is and where the biggest audiences remain, it's just a while away. Is that your fault as executive producer?
Yes, fundamentally. No, look, I mean, I guess I would just say that that in a linear TV sense, in a purely linear TV sense, Sunday 9 a.m. is not necessarily the time slot that you'd pick, but the way that media works now, we're putting all of our interviews out on YouTube and on TVNZ On Demand, and you can listen to the show as a podcast, and you can read articles that come out of the interviews on a lot of websites, not just One News. Other media tend to, each week pick up something from the show that they'll turn into a story of their own. And yeah, I mean, I think linear TV ratings they're obviously important if you're an advertiser. They're important no matter what. You want people watching the show when it's on. But ultimately, I think there are very different ways to measure impact as well. And if something is going well on the show itself, it's also going to be going well when you chuck the interview on YouTube later on.
Yeah. I was the one who rallied for it to move back to 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings. I shouldn't get in trouble for that. It was before your time. Yes. There were a few problems with Monday night. First of all, we didn't have a regular time slot. It always changed. Second of all, terrible time in terms of the news week, because you have a post-cab press conference on a Monday afternoon. So you prep all week for your show, and then Jacinda Ardern comes out and makes an announcement at 4:30 that completely changes it, and then they refuse to put anyone up. So it wasn't working in terms of the news cycle. We had a larger audience in the evenings, but a way less engaged and dedicated audience. And so the thing I like about Sunday mornings is that our audience is pretty consistent. And I mean that they are political types, but I would like to think they are also people who are, that we have CEOs and business leaders and organisation leaders and a relatively well kind of tuned in audience.
I think, honestly, with some shows we get bigger numbers than other shows, but on the shows that have bigger numbers, I look at that and I think, well, we've actually managed to get through to just a lot of everyday New Zealanders as well. I mean, and in a way that, that's always been quite gratifying when we've done that, because I think we've trusted in the in terms of the programming that we're doing, we've trusted in the intelligence and understanding that people have, and said that this is serious television, but people respond to that in a way that's quite good, and people like that.
And the other thing about the 7 o'clock slot, and everyone who laments that we don't have interviewing at 7 o'clock, I would love to see a show like ours at 7 o'clock if there was a strong audience for it. But the reason that we don't have a strong interviewing show at 7 o'clock on either channel, the reason that Campbell Live doesn't exist now, unfortunately, is because and it's a chicken and egg situation, it's because the mass audience doesn't want it. The mass audience wants Shortland Street or 7 Sharp or The Project, and then they want to watch Married at First Sight or whatever else. And those shows weren't commercially viable. What does that say about the news media? Well, it says as much about the news media as it does about society at large, I think. But those are decisions that have been made for commercial reasons, and
that's what'll be interesting.
But just going back to that other point, though, I think that mattered a lot more 10 years ago than it does now. I think when Campbell Live was taken off air, there was a genuine outcry from those members of the public who were really invested in it. But I genuinely think now there's, maybe a less of a need for that really hard news show at 7 p.m., People
are exposed to much more news during the day than they used to be.
Yeah.
But I think that, respectfully, I think that's a bullshit answer.
Alex.
Wow, God.
Because I feel like news is everywhere and all the time, but it's highly managed and choreographed, and that sort of white hot heat of a big audience and nowhere to hide and live and not sort of kind of frittering out of the day. I think that's different, and I love you. That's why I can say that it was a bullshit answer. Because, and this is what ultimately we're leading to, and I think this is an interesting, situation that could potentially fall out of the merger. Is a potentially a situation where you might have some product differentiation. Like right now, the product and 7 Sharp are matcher shows essentially, and TVNZ still, it's going to have this monster lead-in audience, and even if it gives away some incremental, audience between 7 and 7:30, it's still just going to be, by virtue of the scale of its legacy audience, it's still going to carry the night effectively. Is there any part of you that's like, well, is there some kind of middle ground even between Q&A and 7 Sharp that might come out of a merged entity that could lead to, because I think there is a public good that comes out of politicians and people around politics being held to account under the brightest of lights.
Absolutely. I 100% agree that there is. The decisions that have been made so far are purely commercial decisions, clearly. And I suppose it depends on the nature of the merger. Like and what role commercial incentives actually end up playing, and what TV1 or TVNZ1 actually looks like. I mean, if there is an opportunity, if the bosses come to us and say, can you make a show like Q&A that's maybe slightly, a little bit sexier, a little bit sexier, but involves interviewing politicians most nights, I would love to do that, absolutely. But I can understand why at the moment, under the current settings and the current incentives, there isn't a space at 7 or 7:30 for that program.
See, I would probably slightly disagree on that there. I mean, if the bosses came to us and said, we want you to make Q&A 5 nights a week at 7 p.m, then the answer to that would be, cool, when do we start? But at the same time, I think what we've got going at the moment, and coming back to that question of whether that would change the programming itself, at the moment, the way our funding operates is we're funded out of the Public Interest Journalism Fund to make public interest journalism. And I feel like that allows us the space to make things differently to what we would have to do if we were, entirely or even more dependent on commercial, commercial revenue and on paying our way with ads. Yeah, I mean, I think
this is the nature of the merger, right? It depends what
absolutely
ends up being our imperative.
We still know very little about what that's going to mean for, it is way above our pay grade at this stage. But, ultimately, I think the position we're in at the moment is a really good position to be in for that reason of who our funder is. They are the public, therefore we are beholden to the public in terms of what we make.
The one thing, I agree that, obviously, given who I am as a person, the merger is a wildly fascinating topic, much as supply chains
Yes.
and
Yes.
the latest out of Rotterdam is to the general public. But the thing that is interesting to me, right, is like ultimately we're all kind of weirdos and harking back to a 7 p.m. era that for people 40 our age and younger has largely passed. And yet there is, that probably is, and I'm just guessing here, an audience that we would consider incredibly important, perhaps the most important to impact with work like yours. Are there things that you've seen or things that you'd like to do with whether it's more resource or say some kind of post-merger magic wand that would allow for the kinds of things that Q&A does to exist primarily rather than secondarily within a digital domain and reach out and touch those audiences that maybe only kind of glancingly are aware of what you're doing?
That's a very interesting question, and one for which I don't think I'm particularly well placed to answer.
Either. Yeah,
Well,
could we do more if we had more resources? I mean, sure, yeah, but I mean, I feel like we make quite good use of the resources that we already have, and that are quite generously provided to us by the public.
Yeah, but if your question is how do we, get younger audiences, for example, I think the Q&A audience skews old, and how do we get younger audiences? Okay, we've got to reach them in digital platforms. At the moment, it's interesting to me how much parts of our interview, if we cut it up and put it online or put it on Twitter or whatever, how hard those things can go. Right?
Yeah,
clearly that's a way that people digest information.
Our linear broadcast audience skews older. I don't know necessarily if, and I'm gonna crib from a term used about the spin-off audience, our psychographic audience, as it were. People who are sort of interested in the idea of Q&A and what we produce. I don't know if that necessarily skews older in quite the same way. It's just a lot hard to measure.
Yeah.
Because linear TV measurement, the metrics around linear TV are very much set up in a way that tells you exactly who those people are. But then when you take the wider Q&A extended universe, as it were, I don't know if it necessarily skews older in quite the same way.
Yeah, we are a non-snackable show in a snackable world. As well, like people, you know what I mean? Like people,
people. Very much. It's a 20-minute long interview.
This is it. Yeah. Like, and it's like 20 minutes, and so, and most people are digesting information and news in tiny little snippets, and so I don't know how you go around making a digital format in which, see, a lot of people like you, like just will like listen to the show and just kind of have it on and tune in and out as they go about their day. And I don't know how you breach that gap. It's almost like if we are to do a better job of reaching those audiences, aside from just clipping up interviews from our main linear product and putting on 2 minutes here and there, it's like, how do we change the entire attention spans and the way that people digest information? And I don't know that either Alex or I is equipped to do that.
Yeah. No, I have nothing to add to that, actually. No.
Well, I'm conscious that we've now breached our allotted time. But
it's only Tuesday. We've got plenty more days to panic about what's coming this weekend.
Okay, well, if I'm honest, I've got another fold later on, and I really need to prep for that. But it's been so good having you up. And while I don't think you've quite sold for Q&A in the TikTok era, I still think what you've accomplished so far has been pretty impressive. And excited to see how the local elections go. I mean, you won't be out there in a camper van, Alex. That breaks my heart somewhat.
Hang on, you say that.
Am I allowed to tell that story?
Go on.
Yeah.
Okay. So, end of last year, we were going to interview Chris Luxon. We've talked about that, and we got the opportunity to go and interview him at his house. And at the time, it was one of our last shows of the year, so I was getting my van ready to drive it around over summer because the Auckland border was just about to come down.
And what is your van?
It's a 1991-ish Nissan Serena. It's a really fine vehicle. Anyway, I needed to charge the battery up because obviously with the Auckland border in place, I hadn't been going anywhere in it. And so I said to Jack, can we, when we drive out to this interview, can we take my van? And he said, yes, but he made us park down the street.
Well, it was so embarrassing. It was so embarrassing. Because we drove past slowly, and I could see Christopher Luxon just kind of in his in his window in the kitchen, kind of preparing to have us there to host us. And he looked out, and I was like, "Keep driving, like a child being dropped at school who wants to be dropped 200 meters down the street. Instead, it was just.
I feel like a national politician who doesn't want to see the government largesse kind of gone wild would really approve of a 30-year-old vehicle. With accommodation built in, being the one that the journalists arrive in.
Yeah. And the emissions of a small city, probably.
Can I just say one other thing about the local elections and the kind of stuff that we're doing generally as well?
This is what I live with.
So one of the things that I'm really excited about with the local elections is getting Fenna Owen out and about. And we haven't actually mentioned her at all on this podcast, but she is an incredible reporter that we've got on the show who is empathetic with absolutely everyone who she comes into contact with. And actually last weekend she had this fascinating story about Three Waters and how mayors in the Hawke's Bay aren't into it. And even though the genesis of the Three Waters reforms generally come from the Havelock North gastro crisis, and the way that she's able to get out and about on the ground with everyday people, or with, provincial leaders, or with absolutely anyone, really. I mean, I'm very
context
excited.
book is the most interesting space.
And I'm really excited to see what she's able to do with the local election, and just with the rest of the year generally, with that kind of coverage.
But thank you for having us, Duncan.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Have any last words that you want to throw in as well?
Alex is amazing. It's just wonderful. No, we feel really privileged. We do. We feel very privileged to make our show, and it's very kind of you to have us on. So thank you.
It's been lovely. Thank you.
The Fold was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with Daylight. It was hosted by Duncan Grieve, produced by T.I. Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.